Okay, in this last lecture that deals with epithelial tissue, we're going to talk about glandular epithelium. So up to this point, we've really talked about epithelial tissue as being protective, right? It's a protective membrane. Well, there's another purpose to our epithelial tissue. Every gland in your body is made of epithelial tissue. And what a gland is essentially a cell that's specialized to produce a substance and secrete it. So, you learned about your cellular processes, you learned about your Golgi bodies. The cell makes proteins, and then it goes to the Golgi body, and then it gets secreted from the cell and wrapped into a vesicle, right? Well, that's what we're talking about here. These are glands. And these glands are always going to be lined with either cuboidal or usually, I should say, are going to be lined with cuboidal and then sometimes columnar epithelium. There's two options for epithelial glands. They could be exocrine or endocrine, and it has to do with where the substance goes, right? So an think exit. An exocrine gland is going to secrete its substance, excrete it actually, and it's going to leave the body. It's going to go out onto an open surface. So for example, your salivary glands, your sweat glands. We have these glands called sebaceous glands, which produce oil, like your skin and your hair gets oily if you don't wash it for a little while. So that's going to be exo, it leaves the body. An endocrine gland is what makes up your endocrine system. And your endocrine glands are going to secrete their substance directly into the body tissues or into the blood, and they're going to stay inside the body. Like for example, your pituitary gland or your adrenal gland. How do we actually classify these? Well, one of the things you're probably finding at this point is in anatomy class, we like to classify things and name them, right? So let's talk about that. We name them based off of their shape and off of whether or not they branch. So let's talk about that. A simple gland is going to not branch before reaching the secretory portion. So this would be the portion that secretes, right? That's the area where it actually secretes from. This purple portion here is the area that actually produces the substance. So the substance gets produced and then it gets secreted or excreted depending on if it's exocrine or endocrine, right? And then compound means that it does branch off before that. So let's just talk about that for a minute. They also come into two major shapes, tubular and alveolar. So tubular is going to be tube shaped. That's easy to remember. It's like a long, thin tube. Alveolar are going to be sac shaped or acinar. You might see ACINAR. That's also what they call them. But we're going to go with alveolar because that's what the textbook this is based off of uses. So alveolar are going to be sac shaped, and then tubular are going to be tube shaped, right? So let's talk a little bit about what those possibilities are. So I'm not going to have you identify these, but you do need to be familiar with the differences between simple and compound and tubular and alveolar. So tubular is going to be a simple tube shape. So this most simple version is going to be just straight up tubular. And an example of that would be like the goblet cells in your intestines, right? So one of the things that your goblet cells do is they produce mucus, and that mucus protects the lining of your intestines from a lot of the acidic components in your digestive system. So that would be a simple tubular. Branched tubular, it's not compound because if you take a look, even though there's three branches here, they all dump into the same secretory portion. So that's going to still leave from one point. And that would be like a branched one would be something along the lines of your salivary glands, right? So your salivary glands would be producing saliva, and then it would leave out into your mouth. The coiled tubular is just going to be a longer tube portion. This would be like your sweat glands. So your sweat glands are going to have these long tubular portions that produce sweat and then eventually get secreted out onto your skin, or I should say excreted, right? And then finally, we have our branched alveolar, which is going to be similar to our branched tubular, but instead of them being thinner, there's a much sac-like larger portion where the substance is produced. So that allows for production of more, right? So that'll produce more. So an example of this would be a sebaceous gland. So I'm going to just draw a quick picture here of what a sebaceous gland would be. So for example, in your skin, but also on your hair, you're going to see these. So let's say this is someone's skin here, right? And then they have a hair cell right here. And the hair cell produces hair. And then right at the base of those, they have these little things called sebaceous glands. So your sebaceous glands would be here and here. And they would break off and they would produce the oil that would sit on the hair. So as the hair grows, these little glands produce the oil that coat the hair. So that would be an example of a branched alveolar. Okay. And then compound would be essentially those same two types, but if you take a look down here, you can see the compound. Here, I'll move this down. the compound, it's going to be multiple branches. So where one branch tubular would go out into the secretory portion, this one you have multiple going out into the same. So this would be compound. Imagine a hallway with multiple rooms at the end. All those rooms are going to dump out into that one hallway as opposed to just one room dumping out into the hallway. So this would be a compound tubular and then compound alveolar. And a good example of a compound alveolar would be the mammary glands. So in the breast tissue, there are mammary glands that produce milk. These little areas here would fill up with the milk, and then that would get secreted out and excreted out of the body. Okay. The second way we classify these things is by how they secrete their substance. So I'm just going to run through these, and that'll be it. Okay, so the first type is called a merocrine gland. And a merocrine gland is going to... There we go. Okay, so a merocrine gland does not lose any of its cytoplasm when it makes its secretion. So I have a way to remember that. Merocrine makes me think of merry or happy, right? So the merocrine gland is happy that it loses none of its cytoplasm. So it produces these vesicles. Those vesicles are going to go through a process called exocytosis, and that substance is going to just leave the cell, and the cell is going to stay intact. So this would be your gland right here, and then you can see here, I'll use my little pointer here, this would be the gland right here, and then you can see the substance is being secreted, but the cells are staying intact. So that would be an example of, like, for example, your pancreas. Your pancreas produces a substance we talked about called insulin, and we talked about glucagon. They get released and the cell actually stays intact. The second type is called an apocrine gland. And an apocrine gland, a portion of the cell breaks off. So for example, your mammary glands are going to work that way. The mammary glands produce milk, and then a portion of the cell breaks off and leaves the gland. So I remember that. I have a way to remember that. I'll write it down. It's pretty goofy, but it works. Apocrine, a portion. Okay, apocrine, a portion. If you forget it, shameful behavior on your part if you forget that. So an apocrine gland loses a portion of itself, essentially. So a portion of it breaks off and then leaves the cell, but the cell still stays intact. And then the final type of gland is going to be what we call a holocrine gland. And a holocrine gland is going to be a secretion where the entire cell breaks off and then leaves. So that would be like those sebaceous glands I talked about, those oil glands. The cell literally leaves and goes onto the hair, and that cell will go through mitosis to replace itself. I have a way to remember that. Holocrine, whole, right? The whole gland breaks off. So I know it's not spelled W-H-O-L-E, but the holocrine gland, the whole cell breaks off and leaves. Okay, so this is just a quick little review video of those three types of glands. Okay, so I'm going to just narrate this because the actual audio doesn't work when I show it through here. So we got merocrine, which, as I said, that releases its secretions, but they stay in vesicles. So you can see in this image, that's exocytosis. The substance gets released and sent out of the cell. The examples they show here are just salivary glands would be a good example of that. Apocrine is a portion. It pinches off a portion of the cell, and then that cell is able to repair itself. So it's not going to destroy that cell. It's going to be something that just continues to produce it. So I said mammary glands are an example of holocrine. I guess there's multiple examples of that. And then holocrine, the cell itself leaves. The whole cell goes, and then the cells surrounding it are going to go through mitosis and replace it. So it's really just a matter of how much of that cell gets lost. And some examples would be like in your eyelids or in your skin. There are some glands that work that way. So that was just a quick review of those possible types.